Hi, welcome to Economics 720, Macroeconomics. What I'd like to do in this, my name is Josh Mason. I'm the professor, of course. Um, what I'd like to do in this introductory lecture is sketch out the content that we're going to be covering in this class. So that means, in effect, I'd like to draw you a map of the topics that we're going to be covering. Also, in a sense, a map of the sort of questions, at least a wide subset of the sort of questions that we expect macroeconomics to answer, the topics that are sort of the subjects of macroeconomic debate, and a map, in a sense, of the economy itself. Now, macroeconomics, as you know, is the study of the economy as a whole. The starting point is the idea that there is some distinct body of theory, some distinct body of thought, some distinct forms of analysis that you need when you're talking about the entirety of the system as opposed to the individual components. That, for instance, understanding investment in the aggregate is something different, or at least something more than understanding the investment decision of the individual firm. Now, macroeconomics as a distinct discipline really begins in the 1930s, and it really begins with John Maynard Keynes, although obviously the sorts of questions that we're interested in about the division of national income between wages and profits, the sources of booms and busts, the forces that cause some countries to import more than they export and others vice versa. These are questions that people have been talking about since the beginning of economics as a discipline, but the kind of tools, the kind of language that we now associate with macroeconomics as a distinct discipline within economics really dates from the 30s and from Keynes. And we can think of macroeconomics, there's a broad conversation, obviously, about these topics, and there are debates about macroeconomic policy, there are historical questions about macroeconomics. There's also a particular form of data associated with macroeconomics, which is national accounting. And national accounting really appeared at almost the same moment historically as macroeconomics, the discipline. And then, of course, we have macroeconomic theory and macroeconomic models that are going to assemble, more formalized stories about these things. Today in this lecture, we're not going to explicitly talk much, if at all, about macroeconomic theory, but we're going to talk about the sort of the questions, the topics, the subject matter that theory then can address. So the basic building blocks of any sort of macroeconomic story are, first of all, aggregates. And when I say an aggregate or an aggregate variable, I just mean something that we can measure at the level of the economy as a whole. Some of these aggregates are flows, things like GDP, trade balance, things that are happening continuously in time. We call those flows. Production, as measured by GDP, is something that happens in time. Others are stocks, the amount of something that exists at an instant. If we think we can measure the capital stock or the labor force, these are stocks. But either way, these are things we can put a number on. They're measurements we can make about the economy as a whole. These are aggregates. And then the other thing is some idea about the causal relationships, the causal links that could exist or that we think might exist between these aggregates, that we're trying to identify some kind of causal structure in the economy where a change in one place is going to lead to a change somewhere else. And then depending on what sort of causal story we're telling about the aggregates, we can build that up into a different theory or a different kind of story about some aspect of the economy that we're interested in. Obviously, there's a lot of things we can potentially measure at the level of the economy, and there's a lot of potential causal links between them, but hopefully we can keep things manageable by starting simple and then gradually building up complexity as we go. So the starting point then is, I think that the logical starting point here is going to be the concept of output, which of course we typically measure using some measurement like GDP, gross domestic product, or the equivalent. But the concept we should always have in mind is distinct from the measurement. There's some concept of the total amount of stuff being produced in the economy over some period of time. For historical reasons, we often use the symbol Y for this. And this is a central focus of macroeconomics. First, because managing the overall level of production in the economy, keeping that an appropriate level, hopefully, at least hopefully from the point of view of most people involved in macroeconomic policy, hopefully having it grow over time is one of the central concerns of macroeconomics. In other words, output itself is a target of macroeconomic policy. But we also think that almost all the other outcomes we're interested in, whether they're employment, inflation, the trade balance, are closely linked to the level of production, the level of activity in the economy. So almost all of the sort of stories we're going to tell about what's going on in the economy are going to involve the level of activity in the economy in some way. Now, this is not a physical thing out in the world. There's no material fact about the world that you can say is the amount of stuff produced in the economy each year. There's a huge amount of productive activity, things that people do collectively to transform the world to make it better meet our needs. We call that production. And that could be building a house, cutting someone's hair, teaching a class, writing a line of code, administering a vaccine. It's all production. And somehow or other, we need to take all these disparate activities and combine them into a single number so that we can have a measure of output. We can have something that will correspond to this variable y in our models. And that's not a straightforward thing. The calculation, so the starting point for us is to figure out exactly how this number GDP is actually computed. Sometimes some of the sort of procedures involved are intuitive and fairly straightforward, but others are not intuitive at all. So if we're going to connect whatever stories we want to tell to the concrete economy out there, the first starting point has got to be to take this number and some of the other variables, numbers we're going to look at, and see how they actually are produced out of the sort of heterogeneous social material that we actually have in the real economy. So that's our starting point. What is this thing? Output. And how do we measure it using some variable like GDP? Now, once we've got some handle on that, the next question is, what kind of story do we want to tell about where this thing comes from? What kind of causal story do we want to tell about it? And broadly speaking, there are two sorts of stories. We can think of this as a process of production, and then we can think of it in sort of quasi-physical terms. We can think of it as in terms of the supply side, and in these figures, sort of this region over here will be the supply side of the economy, meaning the stuff that we imagine as being some sort of more or less objective physical reality out there. There's a certain number of human beings available to provide their labor to the economy. That's the labor force. There's a certain amount of machinery, equipment, software, human knowledge, organization, and production embodied in capital, which again, we think we can measure as some kind of stock. There's an available production technology. These things are the supply side of the economy. They're out there. And we can think of the total amount of production in the economy as coming from the combination of these different elements. You take so much labor, you take so much capital, use a certain technology, you throw them in a pot, and out comes a certain amount of useful stuff. And from that point of view, we're sort of imagining this output as the result of some kind of production process. And there's, as we'll discuss, there's obviously a sort of kinds of stories that you tell in this way, and certainly sometimes political implications and other larger implications. But in principle, it's certainly one way we can think about this thing, output. The other way we can think of output as being the result of the total amount of spending in the economy. We can think of it, measure it as spending. And the reasons we might think of it that way, first of all, we may believe that there's a production process involving capital, technology, and labor being combined, but what we actually observe are a set of payments. Almost everything we observe in the real economy takes the form of some money payment. That's what we record, write down, and aggregate up into our aggregate variables. So it's actually these purchases of these final goods are what we actually observe in the world. So it might make sense to sort of think about output as being the sum of the spending rather than the result of the production. This obviously also fits a sort of Keynesian view of the world where it's demand, it's spending that determines the level of production in the economy. So if that's the case, obviously then we're going to, if we want to explain why this thing Y is higher in one year and lower in another year, we might say, well, there's more investment spending in the economy. There's more consumption spending in the economy. So that would be a more logical story if we have that sort of Keynesian framework. And finally, it may be useful to classify output in terms of whether it's intended for consumption use, whether it's intended for business investment, whether it's intended for government spending. So we'll have to, of course, explore exactly what goes into each of these boxes over on the left, but this is what's called the national income identity, which says total output in the economy is going to be the sum of these categories here. And it's another way of looking at this thing Y. It's the sum of all of the final expenditure by various units participating in the economy. A different way of seeing the same thing. Now, these two ways of looking at output suggest sort of two different stories about how to think about the main causal relationships involved. And so we're going to spend, our next thing is going to be contrasting these two sort of basic stories about what's going on at the sort of highest level. The classical story essentially says this. And we say classical because this is sort of set up as the thing that Keynes was responding to, the pre-Keynesian view of how the economy works. As always, real history is much more complicated than that, but certainly this is an alternative to the Keynesian story that was espoused to various degrees and in various ways by people before Keynes, and in many contexts by people since then as well. So the basic story here, which we'll go through in more detail, is that we have the level of output is determined on the supply side. On the one hand, you have people's willingness to work. You have some kind of labor supply. And on the other hand, you have the amount that people can produce, which is going to determine how much they're paid. And people balance how much they don't want to work with how much they can produce, and therefore how much they'll be paid. And together that determines how much the economy can produce. And in this framework, how much the economy can produce is how much it does produce. You have a certain amount of output based on your available labor and how productive they are. And this is a one-way story. The supply side is determining output. At that point, people's spending decisions determine how that output is divided between consumption goods and investment goods. In other words, we imagine that the agents in the economy, households, whoever they are deciding how much of what we produce do we want to use now to meet our immediate needs and how much do we want to save for investing later. Now, since the investment decision and the saving decision are taken by different people, businesses invest, households save, there's a market in which those things balance. And that market we think of in terms of the interest rate, that essentially there's loanable funds. People are setting aside some of their income as savings. And over here, you have businesses that would like to use those savings for investment. And there's a price, the interest rate, that keeps the supply of savings from households exactly balanced with the demand for those savings for business investment. And so the interest rate mediates between savings and investment and keeps them equal. And that determines how that quantity of output, which was determined on the supply side, gets divided between current consumption and investment for the future. Meanwhile, down here, we've got money. In this story, money is not influencing any of the real economy at all. There's something we call the classical dichotomy, which is basically a wall here. And all the changes in the supply of money in the economy are doing is changing the price level. So M here is money, P is the price level, and they're off in their own little bubble, isolated from the real economy. In the real strong form of the classical story, and you will find certain people still espousing it today, nothing a central bank does, nothing the financial system does can really change the level of real activity in the economy. If you get more money, more credit, you get more inflation, and that's it. So that's our classical story. Now, the alternative is laid out by Keynes is quite different, and in some ways is probably the way in many contexts, but we'll talk about how you reconcile these in a moment, people continue to think about what's going on in the economy. So in this version of the story, in Keynes's version of the story, output is determined by spending decisions. So that's sort of one critical element of the Keynesian revolution. It's not the case that the economy produces as much as it's capable of producing. It produces as much as people are choosing to buy, but not all spending decisions. In Keynes's story, consumption is basically passive. Consumption is simply determined in a fairly mechanical way by people's income. Savings is also passive. A certain fraction of income is saved. It's not having any effect on the rest of the system. The key issue, what's driving the behavior of the system is investment. The more investment, the more output. And then the more output, the more consumption, and the more employment. So there's a very clear causal structure here. In the classical story, savings and investment are sort of balancing against each other. Here, there's a clear one-way story. Investment is driving consumption, savings, employment. So what's determining investment? Well, here Keynes says that investment is forward-looking. You're making an investment decision in order to realize a profit somewhere down the road, but you don't know what the future is going to be. If you're putting up a big apartment building today in New York City, you're taking out a mortgage 10, 20, 30 years. So you have to have some belief about what the rental market is going to look like in 10 or 20, 30 years. But the truth is you don't know. So there's a strong uncertainty involved, a fundamental uncertainty in people's expectations of the future, which means that the investment decision is inherently a little bit unstable. It's poorly grounded. There's a space here for just optimism or pessimism, not because people are irrational, because there's actually, you need to make forward-looking decisions, and yet there's really no rational basis for doing so. So these expectations that are sort of arbitrary and ungrounded can play a big role in investment. But investment is also influenced by the interest rate. That much is carried over from the classical story. But now the interest rate has nothing to do with savings. There's no link here. No link there at all. Interest rate is instead determined by the supply of money. This is an older view that goes back to people like Walter Bagehot, the author of Lombard Street, and older English economists like Thornton, but has generally, up till Keynes, was definitely a minority view. But here in Keynes' story, it's determined by the interest rate and by people's demand for liquidity, which we can think of as safety, flexibility, which makes people want money rather than real goods. So how much money there is versus how much safety or flexibility people want tells you the price of money, which is the interest rate. The interest rate, in combination with people's more or less well-founded expectations, determines the level of investment. That level of investment determines the level of output, and then consumption, savings, and employment follow from output. So this is a very different story. So that's sort of the basic sort of theoretical divide we can point to it in some ways, sort of at the heart of macroeconomics. Now, so we'll spend the third week developing that story. Now we can move on, once we've talked about output, to our next set of major aggregates, outcomes that we care about, which are employment and unemployment, the labor market. We typically think of the policy target here not as employment as such, but as unemployment. For various reasons, it makes more sense to measure unemployment. It makes more sense to think we want to keep unemployment low than that we want to keep employment high. Unemployment is a function of output. In fact, it's such a regular and consistent function of output that we can put numbers on the relationship and give it a name, Okun's law. But it's not only a function of output. There's also the question of the supply side factors here. In general, we think in this framework that if output is constant and productivity rises, if you're producing the same amount of stuff and you need fewer people to produce it, then you're going to have less employment, more unemployment. How important that is in practice, how much variation unemployment is actually driven by these sort of technological factors is a hotly debated subject. But at least in principle, we should see a link from here where faster productivity growth can, in principle, lead to higher unemployment. And similarly, at least in principle, and again, it's a very important question, how important this is in the variation we actually see in unemployment. But in principle, a change in the supply of labor, if you don't compensate for it with faster growth, is going to have an effect on the unemployment rate. So the first question then is sort of the determination of unemployment. In the short run, primarily by output, but also potentially by these supply side factors. The second question is the question of wages. Again, we believe in the classical story, wages are set by marginal product. But now we're going to say we think wages are actually set in large part by labor market conditions. When unemployment is high, wages are going to be lower. Workers don't have many alternatives. When unemployment is low, wages will be higher. And then other institutions that influence the bargaining power of workers are also going to have a factor here. Strong unions, regulation, and so on. So the outcome of wages is it's not a market where people are paid their marginal product. And this actually is not necessarily a radical idea. In some ways, it's an idea that's to some extent well established in the mainstream, that there's a bargaining process that happens to determine the wage. So those are sort of our two big questions: the link to unemployment and then the link to wages. Now, a third question we might ask is, isn't there also, or couldn't there also be a link this way? Could high wages cause higher unemployment? And this, one of the most interesting empirical developments in economics over the past 15 or 20 years, has been a real shift in views on that, with a lot of new research showing repeatedly that measures that raise wages, like minimum wages do not, in fact, reduce employment. So it's interesting both to see this pattern, which is really quite well established, but also to think about why that might be the case. So, the third thing we're going to talk about here is the fact that that relationship does not seem to exist. So after the labor market, we move on to inflation. When we're talking about inflation, the first question we're going to have to ask again is how do we measure it? And that will be true of unemployment too. We're going to have to ask how do we measure unemployment? Who exactly is being counted there? But similarly, inflation, it's a sort of seems like an obvious concept, a general rise in the price level. That's what we mean by inflation in general. But when you start asking, well, which price level and how do you actually determine if prices in general are rising, given that prices of different goods are going to be moving in different ways? It's a very tricky thing. Assuming we can measure it in some way that we feel reasonably comfortable with, we then ask, well, what is determining inflation? And in sort of modern mainstream economics, the central idea is something called the Phillips curve, which essentially says that inflation, like unemployment, is mostly determined by the level of output. When the economy grows more rapidly, in the sort of orthodox story, which we'll talk about, although I think it's falling a little bit out of favor, the economy grows more rapidly, unemployment falls, workers demand higher wages, and then businesses pass those higher wages on in the form of higher costs. The notion here is higher prices. Workers have some sort of, producers have some degree of market power. And I've put market power and bargaining power in little dash lines because they're not aggregates. They're not things we can observe or measure directly, but we know they exist and are important. Market power that allows them to sell above their costs. So if their costs go up, they'll raise their prices in proportion. And so in this story, the effect of low unemployment, although it raises wages, it does not actually raise workers' standard of living because those high wages then just get passed on to inflation. Now there's a broader sense where the Phillips curve could describe any sort of relationship between the level of output and inflation. And that could also include other factors that might lead prices to rise when output rises. But the sort of traditional story, which was really dominant for much of the last 20 or 30 years, focused on this link via wages. Now, we also, again, think the supply side factors are going to influence inflation. In general, if the productive capacity of the economy rises and the level of spending does not rise, then inflation is going to be lower. So there's a sense in which if you have an improvement in productivity so that the potential output of the economy rises, then you need to see faster growth in actual output in order to keep inflation stable. And that's been one of the big debates around inflation over recent years. But the central questions here are, first of all, how do we measure this thing? Secondly, is it really linked to wages? Is it linked more broadly to output? How important are these supply side factors? And then, why is it a focus for policy? Why do we care about inflation? Now, while we're talking about inflation, we're also going to have to think about some other stories that might be used to explain inflation. So some people are going to focus on the money supply. A traditional story you hear about inflation is, well, it's because you've got more money chasing fewer goods. The money supply increased too much, so prices went up. In modern economies, this does not make sense. No, we don't tell this story. We don't even really talk about money as a distinct variable. We don't believe, first of all, that there really is one thing that we can call money. It's in modern economies, money is created by banks as transactions happen. There's a lot of stuff that's sort of money, sort of not money. The notion that you have a certain amount of money in the economy really doesn't make sense. And there's really no reason to think that to the extent we can measure money, that's driving inflation. So we don't tell that story in a modern setting. We do sometimes think, though, that the exchange rate, if we're looking for a monetary influence on inflation, for some countries, especially in Latin America, but many developing countries, the price of their money relative to other monies in the world has a big effect on their domestic prices as well. Mostly we're leaving the international stuff out till the end of the story, but here we have to bring it in. And then there's inertia, which basically means once inflation gets high, people set prices and demand wages in a sort of forward-looking way based on what they think costs are going to be, what other prices are going to be, in a year or whatever time frame they're working with. So once people get used to high inflation, they set prices and demand wages accordingly. And if people get used to low inflation, they set prices and demand wages accordingly, so that high or low inflation, once established, becomes quite stable. That's why I've drawn this loop from inflation going back to inflation. So then we can move on from inflation to monetary policy. And traditionally, again, monetary policy has really been defined in some cases as being exclusively or certainly largely about controlling inflation, but in principle, it may also be targeting unemployment or the level of output or other things as well. In the US, the Federal Reserve has a legal mandate to give weight to both unemployment and inflation, although that's been interpreted in very different ways. Um, and this is a central part of the sort of story of macroeconomics. In many ways, sort of modern mainstream macroeconomics is almost just a story about what central banks should do, or maybe a kind of after the fact justification of what they do. So a simple story here, if we take our Phillips curve story that we were already telling about this link from output to inflation, then the question is, how do you keep output at the right level to keep inflation stable? And the answer is, well, again, we have this Keynesian vision where investment is determining output. Investment is sensitive to the interest rate, and the interest rate is a function of the supply of money. This is sort of a sort of one reading of Keynes, although certainly not the only possible reading of Keynes. And so what you need to do is have a central bank that controls the money supply in such a way as to keep the interest rate at the right level, to keep investment at the right level, to keep output at the right level, to keep inflation stable. And that's sort of the central job of the central bank. What can make this tricky, of course, is if there's changes in potential output, then the level of actual output that keeps inflation steady is going to change. So the central bank has to be constantly alert to sort of what's going on the supply side here. Now, in the real world, of course, this story isn't going to do even as a first approximation, because as we know, as I just said, there's really no such thing as a supply of money. That's not what the central bank is doing. They're controlling an interest rate, a policy interest rate, a single interest rate the central bank focuses on. In the US, traditionally the federal funds rate. So they're not directly setting the money supply. And in addition, there are other interest rates in the economy. So the federal funds rate, you have to hope, is getting passed through to the other market interest rates. It's also not the case that anybody can borrow as much as they want at the going interest rate. There are standards that banks demand, collateral requirements, all sorts of things, down payments. So the ability of a household or a business to borrow is not unlimited, and the availability of credit is just sometimes as important as the interest rate in terms of determining how much credit is available for investment. And then, of course, making credit available doesn't necessarily mean that people are actually going to borrow. So there's a lot of intermediate steps along here. But again, hopefully, if you can manage to get your policy rate passed on to market rates, if that change is not offset by inflation, because higher inflation reduces the real interest rate, if that actually leads people to borrow, if alternatively, if the banks lend on more generous terms, then you get the change you want. And then the other two pieces I've added here are, first of all, we often think in terms of a policy rule, a sort of automatic feedback, so that the federal funds rate or the policy rate is being set automatically based on the current level of inflation or the current level of output or some combination of the two. And that turns this into sort of an automatic feedback loop. It makes it seem like it's going to stabilize itself automatically, which is very, very attractive property for most economists. And then I've stuck money off here on the side as just sort of an incidental appendage, a side effect of credit growth, which is the right way to think of it in modern economies, as we'll see. Now, once we introduce financial markets into the picture, then we have to deal with some other complexities, and we're going to spend some time on that. People like Hyman Minsky, who've really been very important writers on the sort of potential fragility and instability of financial markets. We're just going to focus on a couple of dynamics here. One is that we have to bring liquidity back in the sense that sometimes people are in the financial system are much more willing to take risks. There's a margin of safety. This is partly sort of psychological or conventional. It's partly institutional. How much of a backstop do you have if something goes wrong? And so the central bank does not have complete control over interest rates, because the degree of liquidity in the financial system is also going to play a role influencing this stuff. And the central bank may sometimes try to raise interest rates, and find that that's not effective because banks are becoming more optimistic. And so the actual availability of credit doesn't fall. Other restrictions, other limits, it may go the other way. You can make credit very available, but if there's a real fear for the future, uncertainty, sense of fragility, then liquidity conditions may be negative and cancel out your effort to boost, demand. Another issue is that interest rates do not only affect current borrowing; they have a very large effect on asset prices. Higher interest rates are going to reduce the price of existing assets, stocks, bonds, maybe land, and so on. And low interest rates are going to raise those prices. And that in turn is going to affect consumption decisions. There's a strong wealth effect where when people's value of people's assets go up, they're likely to consume more. So that can be another important channel by which interest rates affect demand and the real economy. Maybe even more important than the investment one is that if you have a period of, let's say, low interest rates, stock market gains value, people feel richer and consume more. A lot of evidence that was very important in the late 1990s boom, for instance. But another thing that determines the price of assets is what people expect that price to do in the future. If you expect your asset to rise in price, GameStop, let's say, you think it's worth 300 today, that's crazy. But if it's going to be worth 400 next week, then it's a good buy. So if a rise in asset prices causes people to expect a further rise in asset prices, that will actually increase demand and cause a further rise, which may lead people to be even more optimistic about the future. This little cycle here is, of course, an asset bubble. And the possibility of asset bubbles creates a whole new layer of instability here, because the central bank may be trying to achieve a moderate increase in output by lowering interest rates. But if they accidentally set off this upward spiral in asset prices, they may get a much bigger boom than they bargained for. And then, of course, eventually that process goes into reverse and you have a crash. So that leads us to what's become thought of as another target for policy, which is the notion of financial stability. I've stuck it off here in a dotted box without any lines linking to it because it's a little vague exactly what this means. But it encompasses some notion of a reasonable pace of debt growth and a reasonable path of asset prices. And achieving that is often considered to be an important goal of macroeconomic policy, in addition to the sort of, more traditional goals of output growth, low unemployment, low inflation. So now we can move on to the other sort of central policy tool for macroeconomics, which is fiscal policy, which is to say the use of government spending divided into final government spending, actual government purchases of stuff, G, and taxes and transfers, tax payments and various types of payments to people. These things can be used in principle to influence output as well as monetary policy. In fact, this is a more direct link, as you can see. When the central bank wants to act, it's got all of these in-between steps it has to worry about. When the government spends money, that boosts output directly, immediately. So you'd think that would be a more attractive tool for controlling the level of activity in the real economy. Why historically it has not been is something we'll need to talk about, but certainly one reason is because increased government spending also increases government debt, or more precisely, the thing we care about, the debt ratio, the ratio of debt to GDP. And there's a long-standing view that high or rising ratio of government debt to GDP is a problem. It's going to lead to some kind of negative effects, and it's something that needs to be avoided. And that this therefore is another important target of policy. And when it's already high, then you don't want to use this stuff if the debt ratio is already high, because, well, there's a little bit of a question mark because anyway, but that's clearly a topic that we're going to want to talk about. Now, there's another issue with the debt ratio, though. It's a ratio. It has a denominator as well as a numerator. Faster output growth is going to shrink that debt ratio. The same level of debt is more sustainable in a bigger economy. Similarly, inflation is going to reduce that debt ratio. The debt is incurred in nominal dollars. They're worth less. The debt is less of a burden. And interest rates on the existing debt are going to have a big impact on the debt ratio. And the interesting thing is, if you look historically, these factors, which I call debt dynamics, often have a dominant effect on the debt ratio. The reason a country has high or low debt is not because it spent a lot of money or hasn't collected enough taxes, but because interest rates were high, growth was slow, and inflation was low. So that complicates the picture in an interesting way. Even if we accept the debt ratio is an objective, it's not actually clear that these are the levers that you want to use to control it. Now let's head back to the supply side. Again, we have some notion of long run growth as being an important goal for policy, which is in many ways a different goal from current output. We think that long run, in particular, a widely held view among, again, most orthodox economists, but many heterodox economists, is that while spending decisions, that's this stuff, this is spending decisions, have the decisive influence on output in the short run over a period of a year, 2 years, a few years. The supply side, which again is technology, capital stock, productivity, labor force growth, have a decisive impact in the long run. The French Marxist economists Duménil and Levy have a widely read article, widely cited article called "Being Keynesian in the Short Run and Classical in the Long Run." And I think that's a position a lot of people have tried to occupy. That's one way of reconciling these two stories. But in the short run, we do also have to think about the supply side, but it plays a somewhat different role, because essentially the effect of improvements on the supply side, faster productivity growth, faster labor force growth, anything that increases potential output in the short run is going to essentially have the opposite effect as an increase in current output. It's going to tend to raise unemployment, and it's going to tend to lower inflation. We think of a positive supply shock as being deflationary. That would be the jargon. And in this story, the impact of productivity on wages is ambiguous. On the one hand, as workers are more productive, you might think employers can afford to pay them more, they'll want to hire more. But on the other hand, a rise in productivity, all else equal, is going to raise unemployment. You need fewer workers to do the same work, and therefore it's going to have a negative effect on wages. So this is ambiguous, but certainly we would expect a positive supply shock to lead to lower inflation and higher unemployment, and a negative supply shock, a decrease for whatever reason in the productive capacity of the economy, to tend to be associated with higher inflation in our sort of short run framework. Now, a question mark about this, two big debates over the past decade around this sort of traditional view have been the ideas of secular stagnation and the idea of hysteresis. Now, secular stagnation is essentially questioning the notion that these things dominate even in the long run. The sort of being Keynesian in the short run, classical in the long run, assumes that over some sufficiently long period of time, output is always going to return to its potential level. If we don't believe that that's going to happen, then there's no reason why growth in productive capacity necessarily has to lead to faster growth, even in the long run. And this is the notion of secular stagnation, that you might have current output falling short of potential, not just in a recession temporarily, but permanently, or at least indefinitely. And in that case, if you believe in secular stagnation, then the supply side just goes away. It becomes irrelevant to actual economic outcomes. Now, the other question is what we call hysteresis, and that's the idea that the links don't run only from supply to the current level of output, but they also run the other way. That high unemployment is going to shrink the labor force. People are going to drop out of the labor force if there's no jobs available. On the other hand, strong growth can actually raise the potential output of the economy. For instance, high wages may actually be an important force leading to higher productivity. So the basic idea of hysteresis is that current demand conditions will then have permanent effects. They will have lasting effects on the supply side of the economy. And again, this is an idea that was a fairly marginal idea a decade ago, but has gotten a lot more discussion more recently. Now, related to this is this question of long-term growth. This, in sort of orthodox macroeconomics, and certainly in the sort of more advanced academic side of the profession, this is the overwhelming focus of macroeconomic theory, is not on the sort of business cycle phenomena that we tend to associate with macroeconomics, booms, busts, depressions, crises, but the long-run growth of an economy. And the story that explains that is really a revival of that classical story I talked about a few minutes ago. Essentially, the notion is we have a production function over here that combines capital, technology, and the labor force to produce output. This relationship is the production function, and as that potential output grows over time, that's what generates economic growth. Now, what we add here to this story, in our growth story, is this notion of capital, and capital is being produced by investment. So the decision to invest increases the capital stock and leads to more growth down the road. And again, now we have the choice of division of current output between consumption and investment, and then there's some sort of loanable funds market that channels the savings of the households into investment. So the basic vision is one in which, and this is sort of a change from the old classical vision, now we've got a rational, instead of having businesses investing and somebody else saving and a market that kind of balances between them, we've basically got a representative household, infinitely farsighted and rational, choosing what level of current consumption versus long-term growth is going to maximize their utility. In some places, the entire semester macroeconomics, or most of it, would be spent on this stuff. We're going to spend a week at most on it, but it is important because it's a central part of what academic macroeconomics is this sort of story about how long-term growth is a function of these rational households optimizing the choice between consumption and investment. And one thing that incidentally falls out of here is we're back to the story where wages are simply determined by people's productivity. Moving on from that, there's another way of telling a somewhat similar but story, but that comes from a very different place politically, which is a story about profits and accumulation. Obviously, this is a story that we associate with the Marxist tradition, but we can incorporate some elements of it into a more, into our kind of macroeconomic framework. And here again, the fact that investment is leading to an accumulation of capital, increase in the capital stock, is critical. But now, instead of thinking of investment as being linked to consumption through some type of trading off of consumption against savings, we think of investment as being linked to profits. So this now brings, I've added a new term here that wasn't an important one up till now, but in this framework is a critical one that really drives the system. Instead of thinking as Keynes did, and as a lot of the sort of mainstream followers of Keynes did, that investment is driving the economy this way because of conditions over on the financial side. And I've sort of used this area as the financial part of the economy. So instead of thinking that finance is driving investment and output, the key story now is that profits are driving investment and thus output. One factor, of course, in profits is wages, since in the simplest, at a high but not inaccurate level, output is divided between profits and wages. More wages, less profit. So if wages go up, profits go down. And this leads to a very interesting story about one cause of instability in the economy, which is called the Goodwin cycle, after Richard Goodwin, who wrote down the first model of it, which is this. In a booming economy, let's say if investment is strong, if capitalists are happy with their prospective profits and are investing, rapidly, output is going to rise. That rising output is going to then improve the bargaining position of workers. It's going to require more labor, lower unemployment, and as workers' bargaining position improves, they can demand higher wages. Those higher wages are going to cut into profits, and the lower profits eventually are going to discourage investment. Investment is going to stop. Either the lower profits discourage investment in a prospective, forward-looking way, or they directly limit investment because investment is the funds for investment come out of profits. Either way, a fall in profits leads to a fall in investment. That leads, of course, to a fall in output. Unemployment goes back up and wages come back down. And this is a story, you can tell it in different contexts and in different timeframes, but does seem to be a useful one for understanding one aspect of the instability of the economies we live in. And of course, another input here is going to be other institutions that affect the bargaining power of labor. We can complicate this with a couple other stories about instability. One is that investment, in addition to being determined by profits, is also going to be strongly influenced by the current level of activity in the economy itself. We call this relationship the accelerator. And so you get a nice little positive feedback loop right here. High investment leads to stronger, faster growth. Faster growth calls forth more investment, which leads to even faster growth, and you get a runaway boom. Or turn it around, a fall in investment leads to a fall in output. which means investment falls more, output falls more, investment falls more until you get to 1933, and the level of the investment in the economy is essentially zero. So this then becomes another kind of instability. And then another factor here is that high profits, of course, are going to tend also to lead to a rise in asset prices. The stock of a company is a claim on its future profits. So as a company becomes more profitable, its stocks are going to rise. But we often, at least in some versions of the story, think that stock prices have an important influence on investment. So this can lead to a kind of overshooting as a rise in profitability leads to a rise in asset prices and leads to an even greater rise in investment than might have been justified on the basis of the original increase in profitability. And certainly asset markets are heavily involved in a lot of the sources of instability we see in real capital markets. All right, now this will be the final 3 weeks of the course at this point, 12, 13, and 14. So we've got the end of the tunnel in sight here. We're going to turn to the external side of the economy, its relationship to the rest of the world. And I'm sort of drawing that down here. I guess down here, we should include trade in here. So the starting point here is the balance of payments, which is essentially a part of the system of national accounts that records all of the transactions in and out of an economy. And so again, the first thing we have to do whenever we introduce a new concept is to understand how it's actually measured, how it's recorded, how the terms are defined. What is counted as international trade? How do we, classify different types of payments between countries? The balance of payments also, though, is used in a slightly overlapping sense to mean essentially whether a country is able to pay for all of the stuff that it needs to pay for from the rest of the world. A country that's having balance of payments problems is one that cannot easily or at all pay for the stuff that it needs to pay for from the rest of the world, both imports and potentially interest on its foreign debt and so on. So this then becomes, making sure you don't run into balance of payments problems becomes another target of policy, not for the United States, which doesn't worry about this at all for reasons we'll discuss, but for many, many other countries in the world. Now, one important component, the balance of payments, essentially we can divide it into trade flows. We write X for exports, M for imports. Trade flows contribute to the balance of payments, and then financial flows between our country and the rest of the world. Balance of payments basically adds up trade and financial flows and some other little things that we don't need to worry about too much. Trade flows have an important relationship with the level of income, as many things do. Net exports minus imports, are a source of demand, and therefore, if we have our Keynesian hat on, a factor that's going to raise the level of activity in the economy. But in turn, as demand rises, as spending in the economy rises, some of that spending is going to fall on imported goods. So a rise in income is going to lead to the trade balance getting worse. An improvement in the trade balance raises income. Rising income worsens the trade balance. There we've got a nice little negative feedback loop. And this nice little negative feedback loop is actually the basis of a very interesting sort of body of post-Keynesian thinking called the balance of payments constrained growth model, which basically says that for many countries in the world, this relationship determines how fast they can grow. It sets a ceiling on Y, because if you grow faster than is consistent with a balanced trade, you're gonna have various types of problems. But trade is not only a function of output. One other important thing it's a function of is the exchange rate, the price of one country's currency relative to the currencies of the rest of the world. So in general, we think, although this is as with many of the things that we think, something we're going to have to subject to critical scrutiny, we think that when a country's goods get cheaper, it exports more, and that's going to improve the trade balance. So a depreciating currency can increase your trade balance, which both has a direct positive effect on output and also allows you to grow faster without hitting that balance of payments constraint. So the starting point then becomes incorporating trade flows into our basic Keynesian story of the determination of output. That early on, we have a story in which investment determines output by a relationship called the multiplier, I should have mentioned earlier. And now we can complicate that by having these two offsetting influences or relationships between trade and output. So our first steps here are going to be, again, to sort of talk about the measurement and definition issues around the balance of payments, and then think about this set of relationships here. Then the next piece we want to bring in is a little more careful scrutiny of exchange rates. And again, we're going to have to talk a little bit about how these things are measured, defined, and we're also going to have to do something which is a little bit tricky, not too tricky, which is to think about the real exchange rate. As with many variables in economics, we talk about the nominal, which is the thing you actually see measured in money, and then adjusting it for inflation is described as the thing once you've adjusted in some fashion for inflation is described as real. A very misleading use of words in some ways, because this is a process that we are undertaking. We are making an adjustment for inflation. There is what actually exists out there in the world. What is real in the ontological sense is the money values. We are making some adjustment, and there's always going to be debates and disputes about exactly how to do it to somehow compensate for the effects of inflation. Nonetheless, partly because it's something that people do, and partly because in some cases, not doing it really does give you a misleading figure. We'll have to talk about how we take inflation into account to go from a nominal to a real exchange rate. And then we're going to have to think about what we think determines exchange rates. And we're basically going to have three stories here. The first one, the shortest run one, the one that certainly dominates if we're talking about a period of days or weeks or maybe even longer, months, we can do, is something very much like the asset bubble we talked about up here. People hold an exchange rate at a price based on where they think that exchange rate is going to go in the next day or week or month. If you think an exchange rate is going to gain value, you're going to buy it to get a capital gain, and that itself will cause it to gain value. If you think it's going to lose value, you're going to sell it, and that in itself will cause it to lose value. So as with asset bubbles, these expectations here can be self-confirming. The behavior of market participants who expect a certain set of prices will in fact cause those prices to obtain, not always or exactly, but in general. The difference with exchange rates is that this dynamic is not always destabilizing. In fact, it can cause exchange rates to sit at sort of conventional expected levels for long reasons. But in any case, in the short run, we think exchange rates are dominated by this feedback between their current price and their expected price. Over the longer run, we think there's a very important relationship between interest rates and exchange rates. If interest rates in a country are high, people in general are going to want to hold assets in that country. And that to purchase those assets, they're going to have to buy that country's currency, causing it to gain value, to appreciate. So we think in the medium run, there's an important relationship that goes from high interest rates to strong exchange rates and low interest rates to weaker, less valuable currency. There's also, of course, a relationship the other way. Financial inflows into a country can cause the interest rate to go down. And then we think over longer periods of time, the exchange rate is strongly influenced by stuff happening over here. A country with a trade surplus may see its exchange rate appreciate. A country with high inflation is likely to see its exchange rate depreciate. Now, this effect is going to cause exchange rates, presumably, and again, we're going to have to be critical about all of these, but let's say presumably to move in the direction that ends with balanced trade. This was the very optimistic view people had at one point about exchange rate adjustment as really resolving the problems with trade imbalances between countries. Obviously, it has not been as reliable as people had hoped. And this link is going to tend to lead to prices equalizing across countries. They're not necessarily the same thing, but our notion is over the long run, some combination of these two links should have a large effect on exchange rates, maybe even a decisive effect on exchange rates. The last piece we're going to have to bring in with exchange rates is the notion of exchange rate regimes. Sometimes exchange rates are set in a market, which is implicitly what's happening here. But in other cases, they're set according to certain types of rules or procedures by one of the governments involved. And in that case, we have to talk about how that happens and what the objectives of that would be. And then the last week, I don't have a separate slide for it. The last week is going to essentially try to tie all this stuff together and ask, how macroeconomic policy works in an open economy, because there's a lot of new complexities that come in when you combine our stories about monetary policy, about asset markets, about government spending and government debt. When you combine those with these relationships over here, with the external world, you have to rethink some of the stuff you said, and so that'll be our last topic. But one for instance example of the way this works is that a central bank which lowers interest rates in order to hopefully boost the level of activity in the economy is also now going to trigger financial outflows from the country. Foreign investors are not going to want to hold debt in that country that pays a lower interest rate. This is our story. Those financial outflows will cause the interest rate to weaken. I mean, the exchange rate to weaken, the currency to be worth less. And we think that will boost net exports because the country's goods are now cheaper. And that will in turn boost output. So this is a new channel by which monetary policy can influence output. And in some cases, people may argue this is actually the decisive one. But this one has a hitch to it, which is that if you are influencing demand in your country by this channel, it's a zero-sum game. Increasing my net exports is going to mean reducing your net exports, reducing demand in your country. And so when countries are trying to manage demand through this channel, it's a much more conflictual process than if they're doing it through this channel. We can also talk about, the links from financial inflows to asset prices, which are extremely destabilizing for a lot of developing countries, and arguably to some extent for the United States. Although again, the United States is largely insulated from this stuff. But in any case, we want to be able to try to tell our stories about monetary policy, about asset markets and finance, about government debt in an open economy context, and that's where we'll end up. So that's the big picture, and you'll see on the syllabus some of the readings and topics, and you'll see that the syllabus follows the outline we've drawn out here. So the next lecture after this one is going to then start back at the beginning and talk about output.